Hello everybody, The Music Fan is back, bringing smiles to the faces, knowledge to the people, and most importantly, music to the masses. And I am back with another Are You In? Now earlier this week, we took a look at an album from one of the bands that is in the lineup for Knotfest. But that is not the only band that has dropped something recently that is going to be in Knotfest. So get ready, I'm really excited as we talk about the latest Slipknot album entitled We Are Not Your Kind. Now, Slipknot is a heavy metal, new metal, alt metal band from Des Moines, Iowa. Current members include Sean Clown Crahan on custom percussion and backing vocals, Craig 133 Jones on samples, media, and keyboards, Mick Thompson on guitars, Corey Taylor on lead vocals, Sid Wilson on turntables and keyboards, Jim Root on guitars, Alessandro Venturella on bass, and Jay Weinberg on drums. Previous albums include Slipknot in 1999, Iowa in 2001, Volume 3, The Subliminal Verses in 2004, All Hope Is Gone in 2008, and Point 5, The Gray Chapter in 2014. This band doesn't really need an introduction. If you've been listening to heavy metal or new metal in the 2000s, you definitely have heard this band before. This is one of the pioneering bands when it comes to new metal, including the likes of Korn, Linkin Park, Disturbed, early Machine Head if you want to go there, with some of their influences coming from stuff like Nine Inch Nails, more industrial metal. The idea, of course, of new metal is bringing this kind of heavy guitar with the ideas of more industrial stuff like turntables. So you get this kind of clash of something that at the time felt new, but now honestly kind of feels dated, kind of feels like that moment in time, if you will. Still, Slipknot has brought a lot to the table with songs like Wait and Bleed off of their debut album, or the Heretic Anthem from Iowa. Let's not forget Duality, or Before I Forget from Volume 3. However, for me, as much as I love those songs, I never listened to a full album of theirs until All Hope Is Gone. I enjoyed a lot from there. It did feel a little bit more Stone Sour-ish. There was stuff that was more mainstream, songs like Dead Memories, songs like Snuff, but there were also some pretty hard-hitting songs like Psychosocial and Sulfur. That one and The Gray Chapter, I've heard some mixed stuff about. All Hope Is Gone I really enjoy. The Gray Chapter, I found some interesting songs like the more atmospheric The Devil and I, as well as AOV and the Negative One being hard-hitting. However, I have understood that this band has gone heavier and harder on earlier albums. Their claim to fame is supposed to be Iowa, and I recently listened to it to give myself a little bit more context with this band. Yes, that album is hard-hitting as hell. It is hectic. There really isn't any point of times to slow down, other than, say, Gently and parts of Iowa. And yes, the singles themselves are a little bit more subdued, if you want to say that word, comparatively to the rest of the album. It makes sense because it's probably wanted for more radio play. This is where Corey Taylor sings on some of them, but as great as this album is and how interesting it is and how heavy it is, there are parts that feel a little bit dated now comparatively to when it first came out. That's where that new metal kind of has that era, and then it's a little bit harder to keep that sound relevant. Also, I will make a note, if you've watched my Hydrograd album review from a couple years ago, I prefer Stone Sour over Slipknot. Yes, a lot of this stuff is really interesting, and there's a lot of groundbreaking albums, but I also find some more interesting lyrics on Slipknot albums. House of Golden Bones Part 1 and House of Golden Bones Part 2 is an amazing concept album with some great arrangements, some really interesting storytelling, and some great lyrics. If you are a Slipknot fan who has never listened to that album from Corey Taylor's other work, I highly recommend it because it is a little bit different. It's not as heavy, but it's still really interesting. I also really enjoy Audio Secrecy and Come Whatever May. A lot of those albums relate a little bit more to me than Slipknot ones. But coming into this album, I was really excited. This is one of the ones I've been waiting for a while. It's been 5 years since Slipknot has put out an album, and though I like a lot from the Gray Chapter, I do understand where people find it a little bit weaker because it isn't as heavy hitting. So when I heard that this was going to be a much heavier album, I was hugely excited, checked it out, and I am so glad that I did. Now listening to Iowa, this album does take a lot of what Iowa did. Though it's not as raw as Iowa, it still hits heavy, and it just is relentless at a lot of times. Of course, being a Slipknot album, you do have a lot of high energy, in-your-face, heavier songs with a lot of overlaying percussion and very chuggy guitars. There's a lot of them that just work phenomenally. Nero Forte, my favorite song on the album, just hits you over the head from the beginning. It is so powerful, has so many great percussion ideas, and it's just so freaking cool to listen to. It is the first time during this album where I've enjoyed the full entire track. Corey Taylor's vocals on here, the rhythms are fast and staccato and just heavy hitting and making for just like a whirlwind of a song. Critical Darling also is heavy hitting, though it does have its slower moments and comparatively to Nero Forte isn't as strong but still has a lot going for it. What I do enjoy is the change up into 6/8 before the chorus. The slower bridge isn't super interesting to me, which makes a longer track feel a little bit longer than it needs to be. Ray Flag also brings that energy from the get-go. Some great drums, some just heavy drums that just sound phenomenal. Again, one with a lot of great energy. Orphan is one of the last ones that uses that energy to its advantage. This one does have an atmospheric intro, which is interesting enough. The full band doesn't really come in until the first minute, but I like the building from the atmosphere. It doesn't have the best chorus melody, but the energy throughout the song keeps the momentum going, which never feels like it's ever too long. Speaking about atmosphere, that is something that's really cool about this album. I think the atmospheric ideas that they try to do on Gray Chapter works better on here. Starting off, you get an incredible song in Spiders. This feels like a mixture of something that the System of a Down would do, but also a little bit of a Stone Sour song, a little bit of a horror song. And what's cool about this is the layering of every part. It builds up throughout the song. It starts off with this very high-pitched, clinky piano that you would hear in a horror movie. Think of the Halloween theme song. The other really cool thing about this song is it's the first time that I can think of where they use 7/8 in their meter, so that is really cool. The melody is the best one on the album. The chorus melody is phenomenal, and what works better is eventually there's this other part that comes in that is contrary motion to it. The original chorus melody is spiders coming side by side, 2 by 2 and night by night, who is food and who is thrown away. But eventually you get this spiders coming side by side, 2 by 2 and night by night, who is food and who is thrown away. One of the more interesting harmony lines that I've heard all year. The drumming on here fits so perfectly for the song. The guitars are interesting and it changes up throughout each verse. Also, there's this interesting guitar solo, which is one of the only ones on the album, but then eventually goes into the bridge part. The contrasting melody lines come in, which are so cool and so eerie, and it works so well for this particular atmospheric song. Two others that build really well are A Liar's Funeral and Not Long for This World. Not Long for This World reminds me the most of a Stone Sour song on this album. But what makes it so interesting is just the way that it builds. So from the get-go, you get these really bouncy drums off of what seems like a tom drum, and then a little bit of a soft guitar, and then the vocals come in. And I think this album shows some of the best vocals when it comes to Corey Taylor. But it also builds really well. The turntables come in later, and then the whole band comes in on the chorus, and then this chorus is really cool because it uses 7 measures in its idea rather than the usual 8 measures. The guitar line's really catchy, and I really like the interplay of the soft verses and the loud choruses. It works really well. And then eventually the bridge comes in and kicks everything into high gear for the rest of the song. The building works so well throughout this song. The other one that does really well is A Liar's Funeral, which again feels a little bit like a Stone Sour song, but it is so heavy and so dark. It starts off so soft, which works so well because eventually it gets to Corey Taylor yelling, "Liar!" And once that hits, you get so much energy, but it's still really slow. This feels like a funeral dirge, and it just worked so well throughout the whole entire song. It feels a little bit like a Machine Head song, circa like Bloodstones and Diamonds or Onto the Locusts. However, it isn't a perfect album. I've already talked about my problems with Critical Darling, as well as my problems with Orphan, and there are some experiments that honestly just don't pan out the way they need to. The first one that comes to mind is My Pain. It is really atmospheric, and it has some interesting ideas. I like the atmospheric ideas at the beginning, eventually going into what feels like a creepy elevator song. It uses mostly electronic keyboard with built-in percussion, and then it has this kind of interesting idea with the melody talking about love and being used and being betrayed by love, but it kind of stays a little bit too long, and even though it builds well, it is about 7 minutes long, and it eventually goes back to the atmospheric idea from the beginning. It feels like it shouldn't be as long as it is, and that becomes a little bit of a problem. Same thing with Death Because of Death. It is a little bit repetitive as an interlude. It has some cool ideas, and I do enjoy the melody, but once you keep hearing for a minute, death because of you, no matter how many lines you are building onto it, just doesn't really work for me. Also with interludes, most of them are pretty good. I would say the only one that is frustrating is Death Because of Death, but Insert Coin has this really electronic and glitchy feel that works well as an intro and gets you really amped up for the rest of the album. What's next is a little bit too short to be considered great, but I do like this really macabre elevator music approach that gets you into spiders. It's hit and miss for the interludes, but mostly hit, which is good. However, my other big gripe I'm going to say is most of the singles, now listening to the rest of the album, kind of weak. Birth of the Cruel, I couldn't place it at first, but then I listened to Anthony Fantano's review on this, and he nailed it spot on. This feels like a Korn song, and it's not bad. I think they bring enough of their own sound to make it work. But honestly, listen to that melody, which is cool, but like, would you be surprised if you heard Jonathan Davis singing that melody? You probably wouldn't. And once I heard him say this, I have pictured him singing this melody multiple times instead of Corey Taylor. Corey does a decent job. I like the atmospheric touch on the actual recording of his vocals, but I think Jonathan Davis would do better on this song. However, I will say it redeems itself with the pre-chorus and the chorus. There's a lot of just great energy, and I love it when it gets to the sick, the sickening, the sickening. I love that rhythmic idea. It works so well, especially because he gets quiet and then eventually gets a little bit louder. So that works phenomenally with this song. However, Unsainted, to me, is the worst song that's not an interlude. Not to say that it isn't good. There's a lot of great energy to it, like Nero Forte, but what breaks it for me is I don't think the chorus melody is interesting at all. And it might be because that choir that everyone's been raving about, saying like how it's cool that they finally use a choir on the song, it just doesn't work for me. It just feels a little bit too forced for that song. I don't think that melody of, oh, I'll never kill myself to save my soul, I don't think it's interesting. It might just be the plottiness of it, but it breaks any momentum for it. So as great as this album is, the teaser tracks for this are kind of some of the weaker singles that they have had in a very long time. However, I will say the saving grace in terms of singles is Solway Firth. Not necessarily the beginning of it. I don't understand exactly what he's trying to do with this very punchy and just really weird vocal with the killers. Like, I don't understand why he's doing it. It is a callback to what they say in the intro for Insert Coin, but I don't think that part is interesting. However, if you get past that, the rest of that song is killer. It's a great ender, has great energy, is one of the heaviest songs, one of the darkest songs on the album, and punctuates this album in such a great way. Though I will say it gets a little bit weird when he's screaming with kind of an English accent. I think that's a little bit weird. Lyrically, I mean, you're not getting much different from what Slipknot is known for, dealing with depression, dealing with isolation, dealing with love loss and hate, and all of these things. I think some of the better lyrics comes from the topics of when he's talking about depression and how other people aren't necessarily there for you when you're dealing with this stuff because they think that you are lying about it. So like A Liar's Funeral and Not Long for This World stick out to me in terms of some of the better lyrics, as well as Solway Firth, and Nero Forte has some great stuff as well. At the end of the day, this album is phenomenal. Yes, there are some experiments that don't work, and there are some parts that are weaker at times. But for every one of those weak parts, there is a classic song on here that features either so much energy and raw emotion, or so many interesting atmospheric ideas that build into something really, really cool. I like how they call back to some of the Iowa days, but also take what they have learned from All Hope Is Gone and from the Gray chapter and make it work to a culmination. Bear in mind, to me, the album doesn't really start hitting until Nero Forte, which means you have to get through 2 interludes, Death Because of Death and Insert Coin, and the 2 singles, Unsainted and Birth of the Cruel. However, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I do think that even though they aren't the strongest of singles, they are still serviceable, and just whet your appetite for the rest of the album. This is a friggin' amazing metal album. This album gets a play on repeat. There are so many catchy songs that I keep coming back to, even if I don't necessarily have the time to listen to the full album. I've listened to this album at least 4 or 5 times now, and it just came out a week ago. This is one of the best albums I've heard all year, and I am really excited to see this band live, because this is going to be killer. So that is my time. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you love or hate this album and your reasons why. Let me know other albums from 2019 that you'd like me to review. Share this with your friends. And most importantly, subscribe to my channel. That way I know you enjoy what I'm doing and want to see this channel become bigger and better for the future. So tomorrow, I'll be back with one more Are You In? Then I'll be caught up, which I feel great about. Anyways, this is The Music Fan, and I'm signing off.